Let's take a look at the Node Event Emitter and understand it first by building our own simpler version that will work essentially the same way the real Node Event Emitter does. So what is it, and how can we build one? We'll start with an empty app.js file, and we're going to build an emitter module. So I'll create a new file. I'll call it emitter.js. And this is going to allow us to say an event has happened and to respond to the event happening. I could create this in a number of different ways. I'm going to choose to use a function constructor. I could use a class, an ES6 class, for example, if I was running ES6, or I could create an object in other ways. But we'll just create the object by using a function constructor so that I can create multiple emitters that I might want in my application. And in my object, there will be one property, an object, and I'll just call it events. Notice that it's empty. And then I'm going to add to the prototype, that is, the prototype of any object created with this function constructor, I'm going to add some methods. The first method is called on, and this will be a function. What will this function take? Well, this function will take two parameters, the type of event that I want and a listener. Wait. Big word alert. An event listener. That's basically just the code that responds to an event. So an event happens and we're listening for an event. But that's just a metaphor, really. But when the event happens, the code is run. And in JavaScript's case, the listener will usually be a function. So when we talk about events, we have a listener, and the listener is a function, meaning it's code. So when an event happens, this function will be invoked. And you could have many listeners listening for the same event. So one event happens, and perhaps all over your application you have different listeners listening for that event. When the event happens, all the listeners will be invoked. Not simultaneously, one at a time in JavaScript's case. All right. My method I'm adding here is on, and that's essentially to add a listener. It's very common to use the phrase on when adding listeners to events in programming because it reads really nicely. When I call the method, I might say on the file being opened, on a message being received from the internet, basically acting like upon. Upon this happening or on this happening, do this. So it reads like a sentence when I read the code. All right, so I'll say on, and then the type will be the type of event. But again, these aren't real events. This is just a trick. So my event property is an object. And remember, I can access properties on that object with a string. So I'm going to say, first of all, I'm going to make sure that this property exists. I'll do this with a trick in JavaScript just because I'm building a simple version here. What I want this to be is an array. So in other words, I'm saying I want a property and I want it to be an array. I'm going to add a new property. And this says, if the property already exists, then great. Otherwise, make it a new array. So I have now this array that is a property. And the property name will be whatever I put right here, the type. And then I'm going to push my listener function into the array. So in other words, this is a property on the object. It is an array, and I'm adding a function to it. So if I was to look at the object afterward, it would essentially be an object, then the property name, whatever is in type. So maybe it's on file save or got something from internet or whatever the event is. And then it will be an array. And in that array will be functions. Every time I push a new function, I'll get a new item in the array. That's all on is actually doing. Do you see that? Create a new property on the object, make sure that property is an array, and then start adding functions into that array. So that's how I listen. Now I want to say that something happened. So I can say emit. It's another common term which just means, hey, something happened. I'm emitting an event, thus the term event emitter. I'm emitting events like you emit rays of light from a flashlight. I'm emitting an event happened, and whoever's watching for it, whoever's listening for it, can respond. So I'll say emit a particular type of event. Say that something happened. And I'll say, well, if I have that property on the object, then I'll take that property, which will be an array, and I'll loop over the array like I did before, and I'll execute it. All right, let's take another look at this. If I say emit file was saved, maybe that's an event in my application, then I check to see that file was saved is a property name on the object. And if it is, it's going to be an array, and then I loop through to see if there's any functions in that array, and I just execute them. I just invoke them. That's all I do. And if I was listening for file was saved, I would have called on and said file was saved as a string to make sure that is a property on the object, and I would have added my function to it. All right, so the last thing I need to do is make this available. Module.exports, and I'll just say equals emitter. So the function constructor will come back from the require function, so I can create as many emitters as I want. Let's try using it. I'll go to my app.js file, and I'll use my new emitter module. Require will give me back module.exports, which is the function constructor. This is a pattern that we saw. So I can make my new emitter from the function constructor. So I now have an object that is a new emitter, and its prototype contains an on and emit method. So I can just use those directly. So let's pretend that I have some sort of event called greet, where when a greeting happens, I want to respond to it. So I'll take my emitter and say on, and pass a string. Let's say greet. Now remember, this is going to be the property name for the property on the object that will hold all these events. So I'm calling it an event, but it's really a property name. So think about that when the way you name your events. Don't make them big and long and paragraphs and full of spaces. Just keep them very simple, short, and sweet, because they're actually property names on an object. Then I'll pass the function, the listener, and I'll just do it on the fly here. I'll say somewhere someone said hello. This will run whenever the greet event is emitted, because I'm adding it to the array. This is a property on the object, and I'm adding it to that property, which is an array. So I'm adding another function, another listener. But it's not really a listener, that's just kind of a trick. What it really is a function sitting inside an array. All right, so I have two listeners that will respond then when this happens. And when I say when this happens, meaning that I manually do it. So let's say I send a greeting to the council, and I want to let my application know, hey, it happened. Notice that there isn't some deep thing happening where it knows that a greet happened. I manually emitted the event. And what emit does is just finds this property and loops through that array and runs all the functions in the array. And I just added functions to the array. So when I run this, there, those two functions ran as a result of emitting that event. Get the idea? You can imagine a lot more code in this file. And maybe at different points, I want to emit that something happened. And in different places, I want to add a listener and listen for the event. And the event emitter allows me to not have a whole bunch of if this happens and run this function, and if this happens and run this function all over my app, all over my code. Instead, I can just listen for an event. I've built my own event emitter, which is really just an object full of arrays of functions. But it's a really clean, really neat way to control the flow and logic of what happens in my code. So the event emitter in Node follows this same idea. Let's just step through this then very quickly to make sure that we understand what's happening. And then we'll move on. So I'll go ahead and launch this. This goes out and gets my emitter. I don't need to step into that. And now I have this emitter object. Okay, let's step into on. So I'm looking for an event type. But what that really is type is the word greet. So a property on the object called greet. And if I step over that, if I take a look inside my emitter, there's the events object, and look, now there's a property called greet, because that's what I gave it. And it's an array, but it's empty. And now I push the listener. If I pull this open again, I now have a function in that property. It's an array, and there's one function inside the array. If I keep going, I have another on. I'm giving it another listener. And when I push that listener into the array, now the greet property, which really is a substitute for my event name, has two functions inside of it. I'll move on, say hello, and then manually emit the event. That is to say, this happened. It goes and looks that the property is on the object, it finds it, and then it loops over that array, calling the function each time. I'll just finish off. And there it is. All right, so I'll stop this. You should try this yourself. Build the emitter, build the module, start using it. Try different event names. Add different listeners. Make sure you have a clear picture of how this is really working. It can be confusing because we're essentially taking one concept and calling it another. We're taking an object of properties full of arrays of functions and calling it events, but it really isn't. But calling it events helps us to think about how we want to use it. It helps us to think in terms of events and listeners, and that's what NodeJS does. So just that quickly, we've built our own event emitter that works very much like the way the NodeJS event emitter does. It's just not as robust. It doesn't handle as many cases and possible errors, but this gave us the foundation to understand it. All right, so next, we'll switch this out to use the NodeJS event emitter and see just how similar it is.